Hey, I appear to be live. Wabam. All right. Dan here, Max SPL videos. Today, I had an idea for a video, but I figured I'd do it as a live stream because it's going to be more of a stream of consciousness anyway. Talking about audio PCs. So if you're watching this on YouTube afterwards, I'm going to try to timestamp some specific spots. Now, I've been doing a lot of DJ videos recently. This will apply a little bit. So if you are, say, trying to find a PC-based laptop, like a Windows-based laptop for DJing, some of this stuff is going to apply. So a lot of this information will be useful. But I'm mostly going to be talking about this specifically to do with digital audio workstations, aka Pro Tools and the like, even though I don't use Pro Tools personally. But they're kind of the Kleenex of digital audio workstations. Now, annoyingly, when it comes to those Pro Tools system requirements, and again, I'm just going to use Pro Tools just as the general example. You're going to find it is a mess when it comes to recommendations. So let me just switch over. Hey, and I'm flipped. So annoyingly, if you look at system recommendations and whatnot on a lot of these platforms, they're just going to tell you i3, 2 gigahertz or faster recommended. The heck does that even end up meaning, right? Like, that's almost a useless piece of information. 8 gigs of RAM, okay, right? And that's kind of all they tell you. Now, when it comes to Mac, they say Intel dual core i5 or faster, which the i5, well, I guess the i5 in laptops was a dual core for a while. Then M1 or M2, hopefully when they say or faster, they mean the M3 as well. So a lot of the recommended stats on these is a little bit annoying. I wish, this is one of the few times I wish they would pull a video game. Most video games will give you the required, like, this is what you basically need to be able to turn the game on. This is what we recommend for the game. And now we often have 3 settings of, like, hey, if you want to set it to ultra, here's your settings for that. So a few things to keep in mind. Now, with that all said, why get a PC? Well, I prefer PCs. If you prefer Mac, good news. The Mac Mini is actually awesome. And for its price, it's actually good cost for performance. So if you want to go the Mac route, just make sure a lot of stuff is being supported on these M chips, right? The M1, M2, and then I thought the M3 was out. Are they just on M2? Okay, maybe I missed something. Or maybe the M3 is just in their Pro stuff for now. I could be off. I don't use Macs, so I haven't followed it too closely. But if you go with like an M2 Mac Mini, you're set, right? Basically any configuration as long as the like storage is big enough for you. Now, the annoying thing about Mac is ironically, is also its greatest strength. These are using essentially a very, very beefed up version of what you would find in a cell phone. I don't know why I'm doing this to demonstrate that, but the chips in these, they use the ARC architecture, I believe. No, ARM. There we go. Windows tried to do that for a little while. You'll find some Windows tablets that are running off of ARM-based chips, which is what most cell phones and tablets run off of. Now, unfortunately for us, it means the RAM is very expensive on the Macs. So most Mac Minis you're going to find have 8 gigs of RAM, which is enough. They claim that's about the equivalent of 16 on a more traditional setup. I don't know if I 100% believe that, because that's them telling me that. And I always question when it's, the company selling me something, and they say something like, yeah, our stuff is so good, you don't even have to worry about the spec sheet. Don't worry about the spec sheet. But the reason it's very expensive to do RAM upgrades is because using the ARM chips, they're what they call a circuit on chip, or SoC. So the RAM is actually soldered in, which has a big advantage of they can create very, very direct paths between the CPU and the RAM. But it does mean you can't upgrade it later. But yeah, if you're thinking about going Mac, don't hesitate on something like a Mac Mini, because they are sweet, and cost for performance, you're not paying the Apple tax anymore on particularly the Mac Minis. The Pro stuff and like the Mac Studios and things like that, yeah, that starts getting a lot more iffy. But the just baseline Mac Minis, everything I've heard is, yeah, they're sweet. Now, because they're running ARM, certain programs have to go through like a translation layer. If you're familiar with like the Steam Deck, it does something kind of similar with their Proton thing to run games that aren't natively supported by Linux. Anyway, let's get to the PCs though. So I like PCs. Now, as I mentioned, looking at the spec sheet, you're going to find it's a bit of a mess. The numbers to remember when it comes to PCs, well, actually, there's a few things to remember. So let's get rid of some technical jargon out of the way out the gate here. CPU, computer processing unit, I believe, is the essential translation there. That's your main processor, right? Central processing unit? Never actually checked. Anyway, it is your main component. It is what everything runs off of. So in our case, it is a very important part. Now, the GPU, also called a video card, that is normally where you would pump your money into if you were gaming, right? A mediocre CPU and a over-the-top graphics card, as long as you don't create too much of what we call a bottleneck, usually a video game based system, or even oftentimes a video editing based system, is going to put more money into the graphics card than they would their processor. We shouldn't do that, in my opinion. We're going to be heavily CPU focused if we're focusing on audio. GPU is, like I said, for video games and for video editing. We're probably going to put a GPU in the system because I do a bit of video editing, as you may have noticed. Having a processor to handle that more and more of that workload is good. Basically, a GPU ends up being a computer that you put into your computer, because your computer is built around a CPU that's attached to a motherboard and has RAM, or memory. A video card is the GPU on a motherboard that has RAM soldered onto it, and you plug that into your computer so it can handle a bunch of stuff. And video cards are becoming more and more important for audio for two reasons. One is, even if you aren't doing a whole lot of a workload on the GPU, it will take any workload off of your processor that your video is doing. So if you have a lot of real fancy VSTs and stuff that have over-the-top gimmicky visuals, a GPU may actually make those run faster, because then the GPU takes over for the visuals, and then your CPU doesn't have to worry about them as much. The other reason is some stuff can take advantage of the GPU for running particular types of math. So I mentioned DJing earlier. Virtual DJ, its new stems feature where it can, in real time, say remove a vocal track and stuff, which I'm going to do a video on that soon for musicians out there. It's using the GPU to do the math for that. So they can be really good. It can be a really good idea to put one in the system anyway. But yeah, we're going to be heavily CPU focused. Now, you heard me mention a bottleneck earlier. Essentially, if say you get a really, really nice CPU, but you put very, very little memory into the system. So as it's processing and it's moving stuff from point A to point B and just getting everything done, and it runs out of space in the memory, it has to wait for memory to clear up and to have more space there. So it'll slow down even though the CPU can run faster because the memory is bottlenecking the system. So that's something we want to avoid. Now, it also means if you have a super fast processor, some of this other stuff has to follow a little bit to make it worthwhile. So let's get into this a little bit. So CPU. Now, I'm on PC Part Picker. This is a great site if you have not built a computer before, because as soon as you pick your CPU from the available list, it will narrow down your motherboard. It will narrow down your motherboard choices instantly, which is very, very handy. Now, unfortunately, if you're new to this stuff, CPUs right now are a bit of a mess in terms of naming. So there's two brands. AMD makes the Ryzen line. They also make the Threadripper line, and then they have like their entry level. So like Ryzen's in the middle. There's like some entry level one I can't remember the name of, and then Threadripper at the top. Don't bother with Threadripper stuff. Audio, there's a reason why a lot of companies or a lot of recording studios out there are using like 12-year-old Macs. You do not need a Threadripper to run audio. Compared to video, graphics rendering, that kind of stuff, physics, it's just not as big of a deal. So we don't need anything that crazy. Now, within the other company is Intel. They're the ones that are going to be most recommended. It's what we're probably going to be using today. We'll get into why. But both actually do work great. Within just the regular Ryzen or the Intel Core series, which Intel is about to rename their stuff, so keep an eye out. They're probably going to be labeled a bit differently. We have a few numbers to keep track of. 3, 5, 7, 9. Higher the number, generally better. Not always, but generally speaking. So in the case of Ryzen, there's the Ryzen 3, the Ryzen 5, the Ryzen 7, and the Ryzen 9. Intel, the i3, i5, i7, i9. Back in the day, those meant a lot more than they do now. Now it's just higher number better. It used to be a actual differentiation between this different levels where, you know, i3 would be a dual core, i5 would be a quad core, i7 would be a quad core with hyper-threading, which again we'll get into what that means. That's kind of gone away and it got really wishy-washy, so they're working on changing their naming structure. AMD, similarly with the Ryzen stuff, 3 is their entry-level stuff. It is fine. 5 is a bit more of their mainstream, works really well, but it's missing some stuff. 7 is the like a little more of a powerhouse, and then 9 is the top of the top. In the case of Intel, it used to be just get an i7. Everybody would tell you, get an i7, get an i7, because they were the fastest, they work really well, etc. Then they came up with the i9. Essentially, the i9 was they took their Xeon, which is similar to like a Threadripper that I was mentioning earlier, and is their like workstation professional level chip. They took those and they kind of moved it to a consumer platform, if I remember the history on those correctly. And that was the i9. So then all of a sudden everybody's recommending get an i9. Just get an i9. i9s are great, but they are a heavy amount of overkill. Remember how that Pro Tools thing we were looking at said, oh, an i3 with 2 gigahertz or faster. Well, an i7 is 3.4 gigahertz here. Sweet. Now, don't be fooled by the gigahertz. Modern processors are getting more and more efficient at using what they have. So higher number good, but be careful. So just as an example here, and this is again why some of these spec sheets are nearly useless. This is a modern i3, right? This is their 13th gen. This is an older i7, so this is their 8th gen. And now, benchmarks aren't the end-all be-all. This effective speed, 14%, is just there to kind of show us that these are within the same ballpark of each other. 4-core, 8-thread, 4.2 gigahertz, 4-core, 8-thread, 3.4, and this is scoring higher on benchmarks. Real world should be similar, but just keep in mind, benchmarks are not the end-all be-all. So if you're looking on the used market and you see an i7, be careful, it might not be as good as a modern i3. Problem. Okay? Now, this is the 13th gen. Ironically enough, so this is 14% according to this. If I click this, 15. Be careful. Sometimes generation to generation isn't as big of a jump. Sometimes they are. So double check, right? If you're looking into a modern CPU, if the previous generation is roughly just as good, but a whole lot cheaper, can be a good idea. But we've got this i3 here. This i7, again, this is older. If I go to a newer one, so this is the 8th gen, and we only have a 10% gap. 9th gen, they've basically balanced out. So once we get to 10th gen, interesting. It's still not saying it's better yet. There we go. 11th gen actually starts beating that on benchmarks. Again, real world, an i7 probably would end up being faster. But we'll notice here, 8 core, 16 thread, and then gigahertz. Like I said, don't judge it purely by the gigahertz. Higher is generally better, but not always. It's the way it uses the processing power. That's what matters. Now, cores versus threads. So essentially what happened years back when we were in like the Pentium 4 days, they started to figure out how to make more and more efficient processors in laptops. And somebody got the really good idea of, what if we take those and basically stack them on top of each other? It's a bit of an oversimplification, but that's where we got into the dual core processors, was they basically put 2 processors into one computer, and it worked really well. And then they upped it until eventually we got to 4, and then we got to 8, and there was 6 at some points in between, and now we're at like 24 if you go high enough. And that's all well and good. More cores is the better. Now, threads is kind of like a virtual core. It's the best way I can kind of describe it. So one core can be doing multiple tasks, and each of them are treated as if they have a dedicated core. Oversimplification, but we're going to go with that. You'll also notice turbo. Essentially, they've also figured out we don't have to run these things at full speed all the time. So the base clock is what it's just running at inherently. And then for as long as it can, depending on cooling and depending on the workload needs, it will boost up and essentially overclock itself. Which, when you hear about overclocking, this is what they mean, is like going higher than the spec'd out numbers, right? So it'll essentially overclock itself, in this case up to 5 gigahertz. Cool. So not as big of a deal for us. I've even seen some DJ guides where they actually turn the turbo off because they don't want the processor speeding up and slowing down, speeding up and slowing down. They want it running consistently. I haven't felt the need for that, but depending on your system, that is something that is sometimes recommended. So don't worry too much about this top speed here. Again, it matters, but the base clock is more important to us, generally speaking. So with all those cores and all those threads in mind, what do I actually recommend? Well, like these days, it's a little all over the place. Especially if we're looking at, say, an i5, right? A nice middle of the road-ish. Because generally from a consumer perspective, i3, i5, i7, I almost never recommend an i9. We just don't need it. And you're going to need a lot of other powerful components to make full use of it. And you can even see here, an i9 14th gen, 24 cores. Whew. It's a lot. For audio, I just don't think you're going to make the most of it. Now, I'm going to recommend Intel in this case for the sake of this example. But Ryzen, that's what I have in my computer I'm on right now. I love Ryzen processors. They're really good. They're solid. The difference between Ryzen and Intel right now, and this might change in the near future. This Ryzen processor here, I just want to see its. We'll open it on Newegg. This Ryzen processor. Yeah, I'm aware. I'm not in the States. 8 cores, 4.5 gigahertz. Now, similar to wattage, oftentimes that number will be the. So many things to load in. Oftentimes that will be the. Oh no, that is the regular frequency. Interesting. Cool. Oh yeah, I guess this is a 7. So that is like pure unbridled. Like each of the cores can run at that number. There's a bunch of other stats on here that we don't need to care too much about, unless you really are getting into the weeds. Like 32 megabyte level 3 cache. What the heck does that mean? Yeah, it matters, but it kind of doesn't. Again, for video games and stuff like that, it's a bit of a bigger deal. That's why you'll find Ryzen will have ones that are labeled like the X3D. They've changed the way the cache works to make it better for video games and stuff like that. Don't have to worry about that too much. But yeah, this has 8 cores, 16 thread, running at 4.5 gigahertz, and then it boosts up to something. I was hoping they would tell me what its boost speed was, but I'm not seeing it. Strange. Maybe that's a Newegg thing. See if I can get to its original just web page. Hey. Not sure why it's a sponsored link. Base clock 4.5. Yeah. And then up to 5.4. So like this is riding really close to its max compared to the Intel ones. The Intel stuff, from my experience, tends to be a bit more efficient for a few reasons, where the Ryzen stuff tends to be a bit more of just like a straight powerhouse, especially because like this i7, this is designed to compete with the Ryzen 7. 20 cores. Now, that doesn't mean it is, 12 and a half times better or whatever the math would be, 11.5. I can't remember. The increase in core count is useful, but here's the thing. Those aren't exactly equivalent. What they've done, and I actually like this about the Intel stuff, and it's why I think for audio right now, they're probably the better option. They do performance cores and efficiency cores. So the performance cores are the ones that can turbo like crazy and run super fast, etc. Yeah, they're base clock 3.4, so they're slower, but again, the gigahertz, you can't just compare apples to apples, unfortunately. Sorry. Into a very high turbo at 5.6. The efficiency cores are running slower. So what they figured out is like, oh, well, if we take these, again, similar to that what I was saying about laptops earlier with the original like Core 2 Duos and stuff like that, where they were like, well, what if we take a couple laptop processors and stack them on top of each other? We'll get a slower hertz, like a slower frequency, but we'll have more processing power total. And then, of course, because at that time, I think we were still dealing with megahertz. I can't even remember now. It's been a very long time since I've had a Pentium 4, but I digress. By having these efficiency cores, basically they just took like really, really efficient processing units from like their laptop division kind of thing. We're like, well, let's cram a bunch of those onto this chip with the main bulk of it, being these super fast cores. And then, so for background tasks, we have a bunch of cores and stuff to take care of those. And then your really important upfront stuff taken care of by the main ones. Now, you'll often hear from the video game side of things that core count isn't nearly as important as how fast the chip goes. Back in the day, video games couldn't take advantage of multi-cores. There are some old games that will only run off of a single thread on your CPU because that's just what they were optimized for at the time. Nowadays, Windows itself spreads things out more. DAWs are much better at using all of this stuff. So in my opinion, this is a great way to go for audio. Now, the gremlins that is using AMD for audio, I think they're all gone. You'll hear from a lot of people that tell you don't use AMD. They're not stable, blah, blah, blah. Kind of. Like you'll notice when I looked up Pro Tools, I don't even think they mentioned AMD. A lot of companies have just not optimized their software to work with AMD processors. And sometimes that is meant unstable or crashes and things like that. Since about Ryzen 2, and we're on Ryzen 7 now, a lot of those have been worked out. Just on Ryzen's side of like, or AMD's side of like, yeah, no, we've taken care of the some of what was causing issues in terms of processing audio. But a lot of companies just aren't optimizing for it. It's for two reasons. One is because Intel has a larger market share, they didn't bother in some cases. And two, Apple. Ever since Apple gave up on PowerPC, I believe it was, for their processors, Apple never really used AMD stuff, at least I don't think at all to my knowledge, because Apple was kind of the go-to choice for a lot of people. They just optimized for Intel because two birds with one stone, right? PCs were using Intel, so were Macs. May as well just optimize for Intel, and then if somebody's using AMD, wish them the best. Usually it would work. but because it wasn't optimized for it, sometimes you have weird gremlins and stuff, and like stuff that just wouldn't work quite as well you hope, that kind of thing. But yeah, generally, I love Ryzen processors. I have one on my computer right now. Don't be scared off by them anymore, but I actually really like Intel stuff for audio these days. They're pretty sweet. So you could go the i7 route. The way it used to always be recommended was just get an i7, and then once it was 9s were available, get an i9. I don't think that's the case anymore ever since about 13th gen. Because like this i5, 14 cores. Sweet, right? Now, keep an eye out when you're looking at Intel stuff in particular. Make sure it has built-in graphics. You don't need it, but it's nice to have because then, one, you don't need a graphics card if you don't want one. And two, if your graphics card ever gives you issues, your computer's not dead until you get a new graphics card. So I usually recommend it's usually like 10 or 20 bucks or something like that. Like it's only a few bucks to get graphics built into it. They're way better than they used to be. That said, the Ryzen stuff that has a G at the end also has a graphics card basically built in. They call it like an APU once you have graphics built into it. Theirs is better for video games, but both of them are fine for what we would be doing. So I would say something like, an i5 of like a 13 gen, one of these 14 core beasts here, that's you're probably set. Now we're gonna go with that guy. So as soon as I add this, when I go to CPU coolers, motherboards, etc., now they're all going to be compatible with that. So if I go to memory, now everything that's being recommended is DDR4. Right now, that is fine. That said, if I find, where's an i5 in 14th gen? Here we go. I throw that in, which is actually, I think, a better price. That's funny and weird. Now, when I go to memory, DDR5 and 4. Confusing. It depends on the motherboard at this point. Some modern processors can use DDR4 or 5. This is just the generation of RAM. 5 is where we're currently at. If you're building a computer now in 2024 and beyond, 5 is probably the way to go. 4 is fine, right? So if you're building based on used parts, so you hopped on Marketplace or something and you found a motherboard and processor and you need to throw RAM in it, and it's like, oh shoot, it's DDR4. DDR4 is really cheap and it is fast enough. I'm running DDR3 on my system in my recording studio. You'll be fine. But from a modern standpoint, we're going to want to go DDR5 in this example. So we have our CPU picked out. We're going with this i5, 14 core. I think that would be probably, my guess, without knowing too much about it, is 6 performance, 8 efficiency. Hey, I'm right. That should be more than enough. And this thing boosts like crazy. This thing is going to be faster than i9s of old, right? And at the $300 price range, again, this is US, or I haven't mentioned, but this is US dollars, so keep that in mind. It's a great process. Now, CPU coolers. The stock cooler that Intel sells is garbage. Just flat out, I don't even know why they bother including it. In some cases, you can find an OEM version of chips that just don't even come with the cooler because they just know you're going to throw it out. Why is it garbage? Well, one, that boost clock is largely based on temperatures, right? If the processing you're doing calls for it to start clocking itself up, it will do what they call thermal throttling, right? It gets so hot that it's like, no, we got to pull ourselves back. If that happens, well, then that fancy chip with the really fast speeds doesn't matter anymore. So thermal throttling, bad. We want to avoid it. On top of that, the hotter your chips get, the louder your system goes. My system right now, because I'm running a few programs at the same time, I'm streaming, it's dealing with video, it's dealing with a few different capture sources, etc. Every now and then I hear the fans go because it just has to cool down a little bit. But if you're running, like when I run games on ultra max settings, blah blah blah, it starts getting louder and louder. So we want to keep our system really quiet. So a cooler of good quality can be a really good idea for your audio PC, because now we have less background noise. Now, these options here, there's two main variations. There is a liquid cooler. That's what they often call an all-in-one AIO, where it is essentially easy water cooling. You'll notice noise level 6 to 27. Oh, that's nice and low, right? That said, if you go with a good traditional air cooler, almost the same noise levels, and they're simpler. They're easier to install, etc., etc. You also get the added benefit of the extra air blowing over your motherboard will cool certain components on your motherboard. To the point where there's actually a version, I don't know if it's this one. No, it's not. There's a version from a different company of these where they actually added a fan right here. And it is kind of neat, but smaller fans tend to be a little more whiny. So I tend to avoid them. But essentially what this is there is a pump in here that is sending water to and from this radiator behind these fans. It works really well. That's what I have in my system right now, and it has allowed me, I've overclocked my processor. I've got like a really old Ryzen in there, really old. It's like 5 or 6 years. But it's still running fine. I can run most games at 1080p on Ultra. When I move up to a 1440p monitor, I may need to bump up my processor a little bit. But overall, I've been really happy with it. I would just go air, to be perfectly honest. Now, there are a bunch of options, and they range in price. If you have the money, Noctua is the way to go. Noctua makes the ugliest, quietest, most efficient, and effective fans in the industry. They're hideous, but oh boy, do they ever work. Now, you'll see here these pipes coming up. These are called heat pipes. So, essentially, they are, it's not liquid. There's a different compound of sorts kind of in it. Sometimes I'm trying to remember if it's in liquid form. Oftentimes it's gas or even metallic. Depends on the cooler. But it's transferring heat from your processor up into the radiator and then pumping air through. So it works very similarly. It's just not actively moving it. It's just the heat naturally moves through the tubing. Noctua is great. I've got a Noctua fan in my system at the store right now. But as you can see, there's a whole bunch of options. Now, there was a very good priced one that was pretty darn quiet. You'll see here like ID cooling, and this is louder, right? I really like PC Part Picker because it tells us how loud stuff is or could be. You'll notice some of the water cooling options do end up a little bit louder. fan choice can be important, but also they are running a pump as well. So you do get a little bit of hum coming from the pump slowly moving, or quickly, in this case, moving water. I just saw another Noctua one that actually looked pretty good for the price. So for an i5, something like this, yeah, cookies, whatever, go away. That just has a few pipes and one fan. That's probably enough. If you're running like an i7 or an i9, then you need a bigger cooler to keep it cool. But the i5 stuff, pretty good about keeping things down. Now this guy here, 6.5 to 26, so not as quiet, but $30. If you're on a budget, these are the way to go. Is these Cool Master ones. Try to find something with ideally a 12-inch fan. This unit can actually support 2 fans, so you could do a push and pull. Don't aim them both in. That doesn't help, but you can do one sending air through and then one pulling air out, and it will help with the cooling. And then you aim that so that it's heading towards your exhaust fan in your computer, and you get really good cooling, pretty cheap, and it's quiet. Okay, so that's the one we're going to go with for our build today. But again, you can go a few different routes there. If you're on a budget, right? Like if you're spending $300 on a processor, I wouldn't spend, $150 on a cooler. If you're spending $600 on a processor, yeah, spend a few $100 on your cooler and you'll get more out of the processor. So that's the way to think about it. Okay, so now motherboards. These are a pain in the butt. Flat out, what I do, I go price, and then I find one that has the specifications I need. Now, for our purposes, I want an M.2, and I want it to support DDR5. Everything else to me is secondary. Now, something you can keep an eye out for is how many RAM slots it has. Higher is kind of better. Not like earth-shatteringly better, but now I do wish they would tell me. Some of these seem to mark DDR5 versus DDR4, and some don't. Never heard of BioStar. Not going to go that route today then. Don't be afraid to spend a little bit more, right? Like, if you're on a tight budget, yeah, $70 motherboard probably will do fine. ASRock, hello. ASRock does, I'm doing good. Just chatter for those who are seeing this post airing. ASRock is fine. I've heard of their stuff. I've used MSI. I've used Gigabyte. Gigabyte has had some issues as of late. I need a DDR5 motherboard. Ideally, I think I need in the 700 range. Ideally with 4 slots. How's this? Time 11:39 where I'm at. We have a winner. DDR5, 4 memory slots. Awesome. Why does the 4 memory slots matter? Well, oh shoot, which one was that? 760M. That has an M.2 somewhere in there, right? Oh, shoot. Daytime, where I'm at. Oh, it's because it's micro ATX. So you'll see this. So they'll say ATX, micro ATX. Don't go mini ITX unless you're purposefully doing like a really tiny PC. ATX and micro ATX are the way to go. Micro ATX is just the smaller form factor of the two. To the point where does this have DDR5? No, that's 4. Shoot. It's 12:10 p.m. at night. Where the heck are you? 760M, 760 DDR4. DDR5 form factor PCI M.2 slots. Okay, that's what I was looking for. We need M.2 slots, and I couldn't spot them on the other one. This is the 760M from Gigabyte. Add, right? So like I said, spending the extra $40 compared to like just a $100 motherboard to have a few extra features in this case is a good thing. Now, why do we care about the 4 RAM slots? Well, if you decide when it comes to memory to go with, say you're on a budget and you go 16 gigs to start. Oh, you're in India. Okay, that makes sense. If you're on a budget and you're going, say, 16 gigs to start, and you find that that's not enough, and you have 2 RAM slots left, you can add another 2 RAM slots or another 2 sticks of RAM. I always recommend going 2 sticks to start if you can. The exception being if your motherboard only has a single slot. It just helps. Now, these numbers here, the latency stuff, can be super important. I wouldn't worry too much. We want to make sure we've got a decent speed, and that's what these numbers here represent. So 5600, 6000, 6400. I wouldn't go much past 6,000. I just don't know if you're ever going to see. Like I've seen a whole bunch of benchmarks saying like, yeah, you're not going to really notice the difference, especially with our processor. I don't really think you'll see a difference. Right now, I wouldn't go 16 gigs if you're building this, but if you end up with 16 gigs, don't feel it's the end of the world. We're going to go with these guys here. These numbers all look good to me. Like I said, I wouldn't go too much higher than this. These nanosecond ratings and stuff and these latency numbers, they do matter. But the RAM and stuff is so fast now that I don't think you'll see much of a real world difference between, say, them and, oh, actually though, we're going to go with this G.Skill stuff here. The simple reason of it's cheaper and doesn't have RGB, which is why it's cheaper. Nobody cares about RGB in your RAM. At least you shouldn't. Now that's taken up 2 slots, so we can expand that later on. I don't know what you're doing that you need more than 32 gigs of RAM. When it comes to RAM and latencies and core clock versus boost frequencies and stuff, if you're doing a lot of virtual instruments and you need, as soon as you press the key down, as low latency as possible and stuff like that, faster your computer is, the better. If you're mostly recording things and then mixing it, so like throwing microphones in front of stuff, like recording audio takes no processing power whatsoever. It is the VSTs after the fact. It's the virtual instruments, specifically like the MIDI work and things, and like sample-based stuff, algorithmic-based. Like it's making the sound as I play it, right? Like a software synth. Those are what you need the faster speeds for, and those will eat your RAM up. But like I've recorded on a 4 gig of RAM computer before, 32 channels at once back in the day, no issues whatsoever. And it takes the same amount of processing power to do those tracks now. So going with a 32 gig kit, I don't know much that you'll run into that's going to give you any problems. So let's talk about storage. Now, this is oftentimes people mistakenly call it memory because it kind of is. This is your hard drives. Sort of. Solid state drives and hard drives are two different things, but most people know what you mean when you say hard drive. We want a fast boot drive with a lot of space. Trust me. Now, I'm running one of these guys. I believe I actually have the 980 Pro, unless it's the 970, but in a 2 terabyte. If you're running a lot of samples and you want it that you hit the button and it happens, go with a lot of space. Okay? By the terabyte, going a 2 terabyte here isn't all that much more, right? It's twice the space for less than twice the price. That is how I would go about it. What I would do if I could rebuild my computer again, and well, I kind of did recently, I would get something like this at 2 terabyte, right? Or possibly the 990 Pro. It's the same price. Now, I wouldn't go all the way up to 4 terabytes. I think that's a little excessive. But you do something like let's go with the 990 Pro. Why not? 2 terabyte. And then you get something like this Seagate here. And that's what you back up stuff onto. So whatever project you're currently working on, you can keep on your solid state drive. The M.2s are ridiculously fast. What that is it actually slots directly into the motherboard. It's not like cabled in. It's plugged into the same interface, or at least a similar interface, as like a graphics card or other cards. So like it's just hardwired right into the board. They are ridiculously fast, and they will make opening and closing stuff quicker. They will make accessing all your files faster. And they will make any sampling stuff. Because every time you're playing a sample, you press the key, it's playing you back a couple second long audio file. It is usually how sample-based stuff works. The faster your hard drive is, the more responsive that's going to be. So you don't have to do anything too crazy. When it comes to hard drives, and solid-state drives in particular, I had some mixed... Actually, I had some bad results with ADATA. I've had really good luck with Western Digital. I've had Seagate drives. I have not had their solid-state drives before, but I've had good luck with their spinning disk hard drives, so like the older school style stuff. And I've had really good luck with Samsung for solid-state drives. Samsung, Crucial, SanDisk, any of that, they're all pretty good. You will find some that are quite a bit cheaper and that have slower speeds. Those are actually probably fine for what we're doing. But careful. Oh. Incompatible parts. Oh, that's all. See, this is what I love PC Part Picker. It's like, hey, by the way, just so you know, you need to make sure you have a BIOS upgrade. It might not work out of the box. And like, hey, we don't know if this cooler is officially supported by this motherboard. Yeah, this is all good info. Good job, Part Picker. I like it. But anyway, those slower drives, so you'll see some that'll say like 2,000 gigabytes per second, which in real world numbers, what happens is it will go that fast and it'll drop down a heavy amount. You'll see others that say like 4,000 or 7,000. Like it gets ridiculously high. Higher is generally better, but it's whether or not it can maintain those speeds and whatnot. And yeah, Samsung, I've just had really, really good luck with. If you can afford a Samsung hard drive, just put one in there. At least currently, they're my preference. But Crucial is good. Samsung, Kingston, they're another really good one. I'd proceed with caution on some of like the direct from China kind of ones, or some of the slow brands you've never heard of kind of thing. Go with name brand, and like I said, Samsung. Like this, if your data gets corrupted, your hard drive melts, that can be a lot of money and a lot of time lost, right? And well, time is money in this industry. You bill by the hour, so yeah, good solid state drive. Now, something I'd also recommend. Where's my wee? This guy, mine's dusty and dirty. This is I often refer to as a toaster, but a hard drive dock. Basically turns any internal drive into a external drive. So external drives tend to be a little more expensive than just a regular spinning disk internal disk drive or hard disk drive. If you get one of these, you turn any of them into that. So again, you're backing up your stuff. Something like this can be really, really handy. You just pop a drive in here. It could be whatever size, as long as it's a SATA drive, it just clicks in. Back all your files up to it and take it home, right? Your studio burns down overnight, gets broken into, somebody steals your computer, right? Like somebody spills a beer on your computer, because that can happen. Now you have yourself covered. So that's something I recommend when it comes to data storage. Is having it off-site is always recommended if it's going to cost you money if it dies. Now, video card. This is where you have to make a choice. Are you doing video editing? That's it. That's what you have to ask yourself. They can be nice to take some of the pressure off of your main processor, like I was saying before, but it's not as big of a deal as it used to be. Intel graphics are better than they've ever been. Ryzen graphics are way better than that. Yeah, and the truth of the matter is, video cards are ridiculously expensive right now. Now, if you are doing a video card, my recommendation for our purposes is to buy used, even if you're building a new computer, because you will find a much better deal on a card. Now, for the DJs out there, depending on your software, I'm planning on using one of my desktop computers for virtual DJ when I'm doing video events. So I wanted a graphics card that would do the video side nice and easy, which is going to laugh at. Like you need, I think they said like a 1050 Ti, which is like a 6-year-old graphics card or something at this point, and like an entry level one from X amount of years ago. But it also, again, you can use the graphics card for stems and stuff. So if you're planning on doing video editing, I like AMD cards for gaming. I think there are really good deals to be had when it comes to the AMD Radeon cards and stuff. But unfortunately, the GeForce ones are the way to go. I say unfortunately, I have a GeForce card in my computer. I've got a 3060 Ti. But yeah, check the used market, because right now, all these cards are like it used to be, and this is the way processors are working right now, where say you have a $300 processor and Intel comes out with a new processor that is better and costs $300. So the old processor goes down in value. What's been happening with graphics cards is they came out with a $500 graphics card and it did X performance. And then they came out with a new graphics card that cost 20% more and is 20% faster. So the market didn't change. We've kind of lost the drops in price that we used to get. It's really too bad. We may see a bit of it down the road. Essentially, what happened is during the pandemic, there was a part shortage. Everything went up in price, and video card companies, in my opinion, figured out, oh, people are willing to pay whatever we ask. We don't have to drop the cost. So they didn't. Now, AMD seems to not be 100% doing that. I'm intrigued to see what happens with Intel, because Intel is actually building their own graphics cards now, not just having them on their processors, but a dedicated GPU. All this being said, the reason that I'm saying GeForce is this thing called CUDA cores. They are a processor unit that's in the graphics card that more softwares can take advantage of than just the brute force power of like a Radeon card. So more video editing softwares get along better with GeForce or NVIDIA cards. It's just the way it is, for better or worse. So if you need a graphics card, you're probably going to have to go with a GeForce card. If you're doing minor amounts of video editing and stuff, like I personally got a 1070 Ti. I got this for $100. And you compare it to, say, a 4060. The 4060 was a bit of a disappointing card in a lot of ways. Still good. But as we can see when I click on the 4060 here, they're all priced still in this 300 range. So getting, for a third of the price, because again, this is what they used to sell for. A third of the price now for roughly 2/3 of the performance. It's the way I went. When it comes to a graphics card for audio stuff, you barely need one. So find whatever you can. Like I said, I would go on the used market, but if you must go new, we're gonna go with this Gigabyte Windforce, blah blah blah. Right? Find a cooler that has pretty decent fans and stuff on it, so it doesn't make a lot of racket. Cool. Cases all over the map. We want, generally speaking, airflow based cases, which means they'll have a front panel that is perforated, because the more airflow you have, the cooler it is. The downside of that is now you have it perforated, so sound that's happening inside can come out. It's a toss-up. Do you want a more solid front panel so it's letting less sound in, or do you want more solid pieces of glass or metal so that not as much sound is coming out? A good brand to keep an eye out for that is aptly named for our purposes is Be Quiet. They make some really good cases. They aren't ridiculous in price. Now, we went with a micro ATX board, I believe, or we might have gone with a full ATX. Sometimes you can get away with a MATX and then go with a MATX case. But like this one for $100, perforated. It's got, this is another thing that these newer cases do. Oop, I want to be on there, but I want photos for the side view. This here shrouds all of your power supply stuff, so you don't see all the messy cables, and then you route them out behind and in. So that can be nice. Included fans is important, right? Sometimes you'll find a case that looks like it should be a good deal, but it is Yeah, it's like $100. Oh, cool. Oh, it doesn't have any fans. And yeah, the Be Quiet stuff is they tend to focus a bit more on sound dampening. Like this Silent Bass 802. Now, for this kind of stuff, hey, they're doing what I was saying is put your air cooler so that it exhausts directly into your exhaust fan. You don't have to go crazy on these. Now, there are, this is Canadian dollars, so keep this in mind. There are server chassis out there that they will be a bit more money, but if you're running rack mount stuff, they can be really handy. Be careful, some of them are huge. This one here from Rack Choice, $200 Canadian, probably $150 in the US. Again, be cautious of cooling on these, because if that front panel is pretty much solid, then you're just exhaust fanning it, and then you don't have as much airflow elsewhere. Usually that means somewhere along the top, they'll have a vent space. This one does not appear to. So there might be some perforation in here, but like these are for like CD drives. So yeah, the cooling on this is like atrocious. But if you find one that has decent cooling, like say this guy here, even though those are drive bays, I believe usually they have space there if you want to mount a fan behind those. And then in this case, they also have a fan spot directly in the center. So you want some type of case. If you go with these, some type of cooling across the face of it. I think this one, by the look of that, is set up to put drives on one side and fans on the other, and then kind of mirror. That's kind of cool. But yeah, don't be afraid to go rack mount, but make sure it has decent cooling, because you will get a better sound profile out of something like this. Gain, not the best airflow, but this front panel will be keeping your noise down a bit. So yeah. Yeah. So let's go with that one. Why not? Now, power supply, go for a name brand. Don't go for cheap garbage. That's all you need to really know. The 80 plus gold and 80 plus bronze and 80 plus platinum doesn't really matter too much to us. It does a little bit, because that is how efficient it is, essentially, where I just don't really want to get into that, but I wouldn't worry too much about it. And they're all 80 plus with some rating at this point. Gold, silver, platinum, titanium, yay, right? You do not need to be spending almost $700. You don't. However, two things to keep in mind. One is, does it have enough power for our system? Now, when I go back here, estimated wattage 425. We want to be above that. You don't want to just grab a 450 watt power supply. Don't do that to yourself. Gain, if you're not using a graphics card, you can get away with a whole lot less. So we want something that's a decent price. This one here is $100. This one here is 90. I mean, 500 watts. That's pushing things a little bit. But something like this might actually be fine. Here's why. Now, if I go and I look this up, Thermaltake Smart 500. The Smart is the important part here. What that means, I'm assuming, without knowing anything about this, intelligent cooling fan. So if it's not running hot, the fan just turns itself off. Now, this is really important when you're recording because the less sound you have in the room, the better. But it's also really handy, just the simple fact that recording doesn't use a lot of processing power compared to mixing and adding a bunch of virtual instruments and VSTs and blah, 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 blah. Or plugins for those who don't use VSTs. Anything with an intelligent fan, that's all you need. Now, this is non-modular. Sometimes they'll call this ketchup and mustard because you can see in there that there's red and yellow cabling. That is not ideal. If you spend a bit more, right? I go to something like this Corsair at $650. You'll see here, this is modular. So if you're not using all of those, you don't have to plug them in. That can be really nice. So if you care about cable management inside of your case, that is the way to go. If you don't, like me, where I just have, like, I think I'm running I might be running a Thermaltake right now. 500 watts. It's enough power. It's a little low. I would aim for about 600 if my regular power draw is 425, just to give yourself some more headroom, right? Like, say, this guy. 80 plus bronze. Cool. So it has a little more of that. Modular semi. This is probably our Goldilocks power supply. So what does semi mean? Well, they know you're going to be using these ones. So just have them strapped in. And then the other ones that you may or may not use are done modular. This is sort of a best of both worlds. So that's the 650M. And Corsair is a reputable brand. We'll use that. Like I said, go for at least 100 watts more than your estimated wattage. That may change if you're running a 700 watt system. Don't run an 800 watt power supply. You want a bit more than that, right? It's just like headroom in terms of your speakers. You want a amp that does a bit more than your speakers can technically handle so that you don't overdrive anything. Same idea here. Operating system, Windows. And if you care, there are some workarounds. Windows doesn't actually care too much because you're still giving them money. You can find OEM Windows keys for like $30 American. They're intended to be OEM for other countries, so they're heavily discounted. But Windows kind of looks the other way on it for the simple fact of you're still giving them something, because you can just use Windows indefinitely with a little thing in the corner saying, hey, you should probably register Windows. Yeah. No, I don't. I bought this computer I have now, I got with Windows proper. My computer at work, we went for the, $20 or $30 Windows Pro key. All this being said, if you are going for a Windows 11 system, make sure all of your parts are Windows 11 compatible. Anything new is probably there, right? Nothing on this is going to prevent it from being Windows 11. If you're going cheap, going used, you got to be a bit careful. So, all this said, with graphics card, we're looking at about $1,300. That is for 2 storage drives, right? So if you needed, you could drop this to you could drop off about $100 by going to a single terabyte for your boot drive / program drive. But then you have to file manage a lot more carefully. So you could do that. You could ditch this internal hard drive. It's only like $65. I would keep it. The big thing, if you're trying to save money, just don't get a graphics card at first, and just stick with a. Oh, why isn't it going away? Go away. There we go. Ditching that drops us to like just above $1,000. Also, if you're not in a rush, look for sales. right? This is a 14th gen processor. Double check if there's an equivalent in the 13th gen that is just as good. Right? I wouldn't cheap out anymore on our fan. You could go for a less expensive motherboard that just has 2 RAM slots because we're only using 2, and honestly, 32 gigabytes, right? These programs are designed so that people can run them on a laptop. Desktop is just always going to be a powerhouse compared to it. So I wouldn't worry too much. But what if you're on a budget, you ask? Well, this is where I highly recommend refurbs. Now, here in Canada, we've got the site refurb.io. In Canadian, they do a US site as well. You can find some really good deals on here. So, for example, this guy here, i5 7500, so 7th gen, so it is a little long in the tooth. Don't know, we'd have to check if we can do Windows 11. But this probably would be about $200 in the US. 32 gigs of RAM, terabyte solid state drive, and yeah, a decent i5. I wouldn't go anything under 6th gen. Don't bother, right? Every now and then I see entry-level gaming computer, and it'll have like an i7 3500. I'm like, ooh, that's getting very old. But this, I'm willing to guess 4-core, 8-thread. Four-core, 4-thread. Yeah, that's getting a little iffy. I would go better than that. Now I have seen on here, yeah, see i5 or i7, but it's a 2600. Don't do it. We want newer than that. But yeah, like 500 or $460 Canadian, so like $350 American, something like this. i7, 32 gigs of RAM, terabyte. The beauty of this as well, this full-sized computer chassis can handle, as long as the power supply can do it, this can handle fit a full graphics card. So this is a good way to go if you're broke. Find yourself a refurbished tower of the workstation variety. Because yeah, like this i7, this is probably 80, maybe 6-core. Yeah, 6-core, 12-thread. That'll keep up just fine. That's probably faster than the computer I'm currently using. To be perfectly honest, I prefer my computer because I've got a bit fancier stuff hooked up, in terms of cooling and blah blah blah, and my graphics card and all that. But yeah, like this would be perfectly fine to run a recording studio off of. And in Canada, 460. So in the US, we're probably looking at 3-something. That is one budget option that will serve you really well. Another, AliExpress. Careful. But if you go here and you look up X99, this is some weirdness, but does work. It can work really, really, really well. Now be careful because a modern i3 will keep up with some of these. But for pretty inexpensive, you can build a bit of a powerhouse computer. We're something around the 100 Canadian mark. Well, this is right around the $200 mark Canadian. So in the US, we're looking at probably 150. Can't deliver to where I am, but they'll ship to the US, trust me. So this has a fairly fancy motherboard. Right now, I don't like this where it does the active cooling for this PUD. Like that's what that is. So I wouldn't get this particular one. Those tend to make a bit of a whine as those fans die. But we've got 32 gigs DDR4 RAM and an E5 2690 V3. What the heck is that? Well, this is the server grade chip, or a server grade chip from Intel. 12 core, 24 threads. Now they are slower because they're designed for more server based computing. But that base clock is fast enough. And we've got 12 cores, 24 thread for less than the price of our motherboard, because again, this would be like $150, and I think our, where did we land on that? I should get rid of some of these. Yeah, our motherboard was like $140, and when you do the conversion, this would probably be right around, this might even be around there. So for less than the cost of our motherboard, you can get basically your full shebang. The way they get away with making these for so cheap, there's two steps to it. One, the chipset in these motherboards is used. Basically, what's happened is in India, China, I think Brazil as well, but I know China, this is like a really big cottage industry. They buy up used server farms that have discontinued their chips and whatnot. Like they bought new servers that have the new hotness in them, and they buy these things up for next to nothing. They rip them apart, and they take the chipset out of them. So like the onboard like processor that makes the motherboard work, and they put that onto a new motherboard, and they take out the processors that have been like those things are designed to last a really long time, and then they build the board around those. So this processor is used, the motherboard is new-ish, the RAM's usually new, and it ends up being just dirt cheap for what you are getting, right? Now the numbers on them can be really confusing and really annoying. Like I said, I would avoid stuff that has this active cooling thing here. V4, I believe, is the newer generation. You have to be a bit careful, though, on AliExpress. As anybody who's ordered from here can attest, every now and then you get something that you're like, oh, that was a scam. Like I ordered a X59, I believe it was, like the older version of this stuff, because I built my audio PC 5 or 6 years ago. 4 years ago. And the motherboard I was sent was supposed to have USB 3, and didn't. And because it was like a $50 motherboard, they wouldn't let me send it back because the shipping would be more than it. Well, I could ship it back at my expense. And AliExpress said, well, no, it's not actually a scam. It's just a mislabeling on the thing, blah, blah, blah. So they gave me like a quote unquote discount, which I had to fight for. So you have to be a little bit careful with this stuff. Proceed with caution. This, basically the motherboard I have, though this one will actually have DDR, or not DDR3. I keep saying that, USB 3. In the US, that'd probably be what, $80? And this is an E5 2683. These weird number ones are like OEM chips that your regular buyer probably couldn't get. Ooh. 16 thread, 16 channel core, 32 threads. But base processor speed is a bit low. So you have to be careful with these, depending on what they are calling for. Now, the good news is mine is very low, and I've yet to have any problems. I went this route. Would I recommend this route these days? Maybe. It really depends on what you can find, especially on the refurbished market. Because similar to that closet industry, there's a big industry in North America of buying up used PCs from, a corporation will buy a few hundred of these Dells, or this one's an HP. Sorry, I saw Pro Desk and my brain went Dell because I was looking at a Dell earlier. They'll buy up a few hundred of these. They'll use them for a few years, and then they will either give them away or they'll sell them at auction. So in my area, we have a electronic recycler that frequently, and remember Canadian dollars, right? Like this has a better processor than that other one. This is a 10th gen. That's actually not a bad deal. They end up with a whole bunch of stuff like this rack mount PC that it's missing the front cover to the hard drive caddy. That's too bad, because this case is worth basically what they're asking if if it had that. I think this is the same case I have at work right now. I recognize it quite a bit, but yeah, you'll frequently find refurbished computers, because basically what the recyclers do is they'll drop off 100 of these darn things and then say, hey, we just need these gone, and they'll take those 100 and they'll make 10 of them work and then recycle the other parts. So, this one has dead RAM. Take the RAM out of that one. This one has a dead processor. Oh, well, the one that we took the RAM out had a processor was working fine. The motherboard was toast. And then by the time they're done, they have a bunch. So these pop up, though, for very little. And this particular site, I can go specials under 300. I can specify under the filters, product type, desktops. Now, avoid the AMD A whatevers. Those are just too old. Same thing with the cores. Like I said, i3, i5, i7, that means next to nothing these days. You have to go by generation beyond just that. I don't know why they call this processor. Oh, no, they got generation. Oh, cool. So I can go 8th gen and see what they have. That's not bad. Yeah. Now, these mini guys, don't be afraid of them. They're actually pretty sweet for what they are. But I wouldn't go with an 8 gig of RAM. I would go for something like this with a 16. But then you can just go like memory and like, I just want to see everything that has 16 gigs or more. Now, there is one on here I have been eyeing, if it's still on here, just to show you what I kind of use or have considered using as a replacement for what I'm currently dealing with at the store, just because I do need another computer at some point, because I need something to be mobile and something to be at the shop at all times. Maybe they don't have it anymore. They might have sold out. Yeah, they might have sold out of the one that I had in mind. Do keep in mind, a lot of these small form factor ones means even if they look like that looks small form factor-ish, you can't put a graphics card in them unless you get a low profile one, and those are far more expensive these days. So getting more of a full towery kind of thing is my preference. Even something like this, right? But again, make sure everything is compatible with Windows 11. If you're buying a new computer in 2024, you just need to make sure it can run Windows 11, because eventually they're just going to have to suck it up and decommission Windows 10, which is too bad. Windows 10 has actually treated me really well. But there is a security thing to do with like a hardware security. Essentially, it wasn't the Log4j, Spectre, I think it was called, where certain Intel processors, there was a backdoor to wreaking some havoc on people's computers. And they fixed it, but in the process, it actually slowed down the PCs. And they've had to keep that patched in on everything they've done since. Yeah, I'd probably just go with this guy. That's the 65. I would try to get better. Because that i5 is going to be a little slow. Anyway. But, yeah, I would aim, like I said, for something newer. But if you're on a deep budget, you can usually find a refurbished tower of some kind, right? You're on a strict budget, this is like $150 US. Actually, let me see the US site. I'll just go to the US site. Because a bunch of you are going to be from either from the US or... Oh, yeah, because they have under 200 on theirs. You'll either be from the US or it's just a better indication of the exact pricing. Product type, desktops. And yeah, see, as soon as you go to under 200, you start to see 4th gen and earlier. Don't do that to yourself. These are all going to be, unfortunately, e-waste in the near future because Windows 10 just won't work with them anymore. But what can you get as a American under $300? I'm just curious. Now I'm just killing time because I'm pretty much done what I really wanted to get to. Like I said, when I look through this stuff, these days, i5 in a modern sense is perfectly fine. Ryzen 5 also good to go. The Ryzens have less cores because they're focused more on raw power versus these efficiency cores. Both good choices. Cool it well. Get a motherboard that can fit a M.2, which is what these NVMe hard drives click into. Get yourself probably 32 gigs of RAM currently, and you'll probably be fine. But if you can get a motherboard that has 4 slots, you can upgrade it later. Hard drives wise, a nice big solid state drive to do most of your work on, and then back it up on a spinning disk. Don't bother with a graphics card unless you need it, which means your processor needs to have one. Get a case that is good for acoustics and for airflow. Not necessarily in that order, because the less airflow you have, the faster your fans spin up. But the better acoustics you have, the less you're the fans. So you have to pick and choose. And a power supply that is at least 100 or so watts, preferably more, but nothing crazy, right? Like this system, now that I don't have a graphics card, I'd still go with this one because then I have that room to add a power supply. Because now this thing's only using 300 watts, so this is overkill, but now you have room to add a power supply. Going a little bit bigger on your power supply isn't a bad idea, but just make sure it has a smart fan so that it is turning itself off when you don't need it. I didn't mention monitors because that's a lot of personal preference. Like right now, I have two 27s in front of me, and I'm very happy with that. At the studio, I have a single 42. We basically just took a 4K TV and set it up on the top of the stand, and it looks great. It gives me tons of work area. Kind of the equivalent of having 4 22-inch. So, where was I looking now? Under 300. Let's go 16 gigs. There's a lot that have 16 gigs. And then processor generation. Well, they have something with an 8th gen for under 300. Oh, that's on laptop. Although that's not bad. But again, they were saying an i3 with 2 gigahertz. This i5 probably will run it fine because gigahertz doesn't actually matter nearly as much as they say it does. Though why that came up in my search, I don't know. Yeah, this is really similar to what I was seeing. If you don't need a graphics card, yeah, something like this. Just double check Windows 7 compatibility. Anyway, that was mostly what I wanted to deal with. Yeah, computers, I know just enough about them to be dangerous, but you should know enough to make sure that you're not spending more than you need, right? Like the old adage of just, hey, get yourself an i9. You don't have to do that anymore. You don't even need an i7 to run a pro recording studio off of. An i5 these days or a Ryzen 5 will do the trick. AMD, don't stray too far away from it. It's probably going to work great, but more stuff in the audio world is optimized for Intel. Just like I like AMD graphics cards for gaming, but more stuff in the video editing world is optimized for NVIDIA. So NVIDIA would be where I would go. When it comes to your graphics card, if you need one, look on the used market. Keep an eye out. Again, get a processor that has built-in graphics until you find a good deal. I found an i7, no, not i7, a 1070 Ti for $100 local. That's $100 Canadian, so like $70 American. Those deals are out there to be had, and if all you're using it for is general video editing or general just use, it's fine. It actually keeps up on modern games and stuff too. It's just not, it doesn't have the ray tracing for lighting effects and things like that, or some of the new AI stuff and blah, 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 and frame generation. Although some of that frame generation does work, but some of it doesn't. Anyway, if you have any questions about computer stuff, this isn't necessarily the best channel for it. There are, for case reviews, definitely check out Gamers Nexus. Gamers Nexus for case reviews is kind of the best of the best because they actually test things out with decibel meters and stuff to make sure that when they put a whole system in it, how loud does it run compared to this other system when we put it through a stress test. One of the things they often point out is that some of them will have a lower pitch or a higher pitch depending on what frequencies are being let out of the case. They pay attention to that kind of stuff, so they're really good for that. In terms of general processor reviews and stuff, them, Hardware Unboxed, and Jay's 2 Cents, and Linus Tech Tips are all pretty solid choices for looking into comparisons. Things like that user benchmark site that I was using. This site's okay, but it doesn't give you everything, right? This is saying, oh, it's faster in this, but it'll say, oh, it has faster gigahertz, faster this, faster that, but it's not giving you the whole story. So use it as a tool, but not as an end-all be-all, right? It's just like any chart or any, like, it's like looking at a frequency chart on a speaker. It gives you a bit of the story, but you kind of have to know what's going on because sometimes those aren't telling you the full thing. But yeah, you don't have to spend an arm and a leg. Going used is tricky right now because a lot of used stuff on just the general market isn't all that great. But if you go with a recycler or a refurbished place, they'll give you like a warranty. And then your stuff is going to work next week. For example, this Dell here, I have to know, will it let me? I'll have to look into this and see, one, if this case is wide enough, and two, if this power supply can handle a graphics card. But this thing has 256 hard drive. That's next to nothing. I would have to add one, but 12 gigs DDR. 4 i5 94. This is at least a 6-core. 6-core, 6-thread. So pretty fast. But like less than $200 American by the time things are done. So anyway, now I'm just going all over the place. Let's go back to me here. But yeah, if you're looking to put together a PC, yeah, sky's the limit in terms of budget stuff. But if you keep, if you keep an eye out on deals, if you're not afraid of, like an i5 or an i3 in a modern context is going to be better than an old i7. So like, don't be afraid of them. Unfortunately, the naming conventions and the naming schemes and stuff right now are really annoying, where it'll be like an i5 and it'll actually be worse than a different i5. So buying an i5 13th gen, but with the other numbers are higher, it's actually better than the 14th gen of this other i5. It's really, really annoying. So that's where like those benchmarks and stuff come in of like, I don't know which one of these is better. In the real world, will it be as much of a difference? Probably not, but it's worth looking at those benchmarks just to see. Unfortunately, almost every benchmark you're going to find, for better or worse, is video, like rendering 3D video or converting a file and things like that. But yeah. Anyway, I think that's a good spot to call it for the day, as I feel like having some lunch. But yeah, live streams here most Mondays. Today I had a specific topic. Now that I have more and more viewers popping on and saying hi and stuff, I might start scheduling this and seeing if I can get some of my actual like people out to watch. We'll see though. Until then, I'm just using it as an excuse to get into topics that I want to ramble on for 2 hours. So if you enjoy hearing me ramble on, like and subscribe and all that stuff. And yeah, more videos coming out. I've got 3 recorded. So more coming. But I bid you good day.